The marriage broker's voice cut through the cold morning air like a blade. "Step aside," Mr. Harlan Crutch said, and he didn't say it quietly. He grabbed Eleanor Hart by the elbow, not gently, not with any pretense of courtesy, and physically moved her 3 steps to the left, away from the line of women standing on the depot platform, away from the light, away from where the men gathering across the tracks might see her face first. She was 31 years old. She had sold her mother's sewing kit to buy her ticket west. She had not slept in 4 days. "The gentlemen will see the ladies in order of presentation," Crutch announced to the small crowd collecting at the edge of the platform, his voice carrying the oily authority of a man who had done this many times and never once been challenged. He gestured toward the 7 women remaining in the line, younger women, slimmer women, women whose traveling dresses were newer and whose faces had not been weathered by years of factory work and grief. "We have fine prospects here, educated women, capable women." Eleanor stood where he had placed her, 2 steps behind the others, and she did not move. Not because she lacked the will. She had more will than most people suspected, packed somewhere beneath the heaviness of her frame and the silence she had learned to wear like a second skin. She did not move because she recognized the moment for what it was. She had lived inside versions of this moment her entire life. The crowd across the tracks, a handful of miners, a general store owner, 2 men in wool coats who looked like they had ridden some distance to be here, studied the line of women with the frank, transactional attention of men evaluating livestock at auction. Eleanor watched them watching. She noted the way their eyes moved past her, if they reached her at all, with a particular kind of efficiency. Not cruelty, exactly. Just the ordinary math of the world, tallied quickly and without comment. One woman in the line, a pretty redhead named Clara, who had shared Eleanor's train car from Chicago, glanced back and caught Eleanor's eye. Clara gave her a small, apologetic smile. Eleanor nodded back. There was no malice in Clara. There was no malice in most of them. That was perhaps the most exhausting part. It wasn't hatred that had followed Eleanor through 31 years of life. It was indifference, the quiet institutional assumption that she did not quite count. Crutch was making introductions now, walking down the line with the studied enthusiasm of a carnival barker who knew which items were likely to sell and which he would need to discount. Miss Paulson, from Cincinnati. Miss Bauer, from St. Louis. Miss Fairweather, also St. Louis. He did not introduce Eleanor. The morning was cold, even for early April. Black Ridge, Montana, sat in a valley between 2 mountain ranges that did not care about the calendar, and the wind coming down off the higher elevations carried the memory of winter in it. Eleanor's coat was adequate. She had sewn the lining herself, replaced it twice, and she knew exactly how warm it was and exactly at what temperature it stopped being sufficient. She was standing right at that threshold now, the cold finding the seams, and she tucked her hands under her arms and waited. She did not know why she was still waiting. She had known, somewhere around Billings, that this was likely to go the way it was going. She was not stupid. She had read the advertisements for Western brides with the same rational eye she applied to everything, and she had understood that the advertisements described a type and that she was not precisely that type. But she had also reached the point, by February of 1882, where the alternative to trying was simply staying. Staying in the boarding house in Cleveland where the landlady had recently raised the rent. Staying in the seamstress work that was slowly destroying her eyesight. Staying inside the life she had built from leftover pieces, functional but joyless, the kind of life that was survivable without ever being quite worth surviving for. So she had sold her mother's sewing kit and bought a ticket and told herself that she would find out. Now she was finding out. Crutch had reached the end of the line and was engaged in what appeared to be a productive conversation between one of the wool-coated men and Miss Fairweather from St. Louis. Eleanor watched the negotiation without particular emotion. She was running the numbers in her head. She had enough money left for 2 nights at whatever passed for a hotel in Black Ridge, and then she would need to make a decision. There was a laundry on the main street she had seen from the wagon. Laundries always needed workers. It would not be what she had come for, but it would be something. It would be a foothold. She was still working through the arithmetic when the crowd changed. She felt it before she understood it. A shift in the quality of attention on the platform. A slight collective reorientation, like a field of sunflowers adjusting to a new angle of light. She looked up. The man coming down the main street toward the depot was not hurrying, but his stride was the kind that covered ground efficiently, and people moved out of his way without appearing to decide to do so. He was large, not merely tall, but built in a way that suggested the mountains he apparently lived in, as though the years had compressed something essential and left only the load-bearing parts. His coat was fur-lined and worn hard. His face was the kind that had been through weather that wasn't entirely meteorological. She did not know who he was, but she could tell from the way Crutch straightened his spine at the sight of him and the way the small crowd went briefly quiet that he was someone whose name the town knew. The man, she would learn his name was Gideon Wolfe, and she would learn other things about him later that would rearrange everything she thought she understood about this morning. Stopped at the edge of the platform and looked at the line of women the way a man might look at a map he had already memorized, methodically, without performance. Crutch moved toward him with the alert energy of a salesman recognizing a serious buyer. "Mr. Wolfe." There was something careful in Crutch's voice, something that hadn't been there when he'd been addressing the miners and the store owner. "We have some exceptional prospects this season. Allow me to introduce—" "I've seen them," Gideon Wolfe said. His voice was lower than Eleanor expected, and unhurried, and it contained no warmth whatsoever. Not hostility, just the flat absence of social performance that some men developed when they spent years with no one to perform for. His eyes moved along the line, past Miss Paulson, past Miss Bauer, past Clara and Miss Fairweather and the others. They moved away. Eleanor had watched the other men's eyes move in that quick transactional scan, and she prepared herself for the moment they would pass her too. They didn't. His eyes stopped on her. Not near her. On her. With a specificity that was almost physical, she held herself very still. "That one," Gideon Wolfe said. The silence that followed was of a specific texture, the kind generated not by an absence of things to say, but by a surplus of things that no one was quite willing to say first. Crutch's mouth opened, closed. The miners behind the tracks exchanged a look. Somewhere on the platform, one of the women made a small, involuntary sound. Crutch recovered first, with the professional elasticity of a man who had navigated awkward moments before. "Mr. Wolfe, perhaps you'd like to meet all of our ladies before making a—" "I've made it!" Gideon Wolfe was not looking at Crutch. He was still looking at Eleanor, and his expression had not changed, which meant it remained entirely unreadable, which she found both unnerving and strangely respectful. Most people, when they looked at her, could not hide what they were thinking. He either wasn't thinking what she expected or had learned to keep it internal. One of the miners laughed. It was a short laugh, involuntary, the kind that escapes before a man can catch it. "The big one?" the miner said, and he wasn't trying to be cruel. He was just saying what everyone was thinking, which was its own kind of cruelty, the unconscious kind, the kind that didn't even know it needed to apologize. Gideon Wolfe turned his head and looked at the miner. Whatever was in that look, the miner stopped laughing. He looked down at his boots. He did not look up again for some time. Eleanor had watched this happen, and she had watched the laughter die in the small crowd like a candle being covered with a jar. And she had felt something she could not immediately name. Not gratitude. Gratitude implied debt, and she had not asked for his intervention. Not relief, exactly. Something more uncomfortable than relief. Something that required her to adjust the story she had been telling herself about this morning, which had until 30 seconds ago been a story she knew the ending of. Crutch was looking between the two of them with the expression of a man watching a business transaction take an unexpected turn and not yet knowing whether it was good or bad for him. "Well," Crutch said. "Well, of course, Mr. Wolfe, if you're certain." "I said I was certain." She hadn't been asked. She noticed that. She noticed it the way she noticed the cold finding the seams of her coat, factually, without drama, filing it away for later. She had not been consulted. He had pointed at her the way a man points at something he intends to acquire, and no one had turned to her and asked if she intended to be acquired. She was deciding, in the space of about 4 seconds, whether she was going to say anything about that. She was also deciding, in the same 4 seconds, that she had sold her mother's sewing kit for this, that she had not come this far to be managed by her own pride, that she could raise the question of being consulted later, in private, with the particular directness she was capable of when she didn't have an audience. "I'd like to know your name," she said. Not to Crutch, to the man himself. He looked at her, and something shifted in his face. Too small to name, too fast to catch, but she would have sworn it was there. Gideon Wolfe. Eleanor Hart. She did not offer her hand, neither did he. "I know," he said. She would think about those 2 words later. She would think about them for weeks. At the time, she filed them alongside the other data she was collecting. The way he had not looked at the others, the specificity with which he had looked at her, the way he knew her name. And she kept her face neutral and her spine straight and told herself she would sort it out when she had more information. "The arrangement fee," Crutch began. But Gideon Wolfe had already reached into his coat and produced a folded quantity of bills that he placed in Crutch's hand without looking at him, the way a man pays a toll without needing to engage with the gatekeeper. Crutch counted the money. His eyebrows rose slightly. "This is more than—" "I know what it is," Gideon said. "She'll need her trunk brought from the depot office." He said it to Crutch, not to Eleanor. Again, the small unconscious assumption. "I can carry my own trunk," Eleanor said. Her voice was level. "I've been doing it since Cleveland." He looked at her again. That almost shift, again, barely there. "I'll carry it," he said. "But not for the reason you're thinking." She didn't ask what reason she was thinking. She had a feeling, unsupported by any evidence she could point to, that arguing this particular point was going to be an ongoing feature of whatever came next, and she didn't need to win it today. The women in the line had rearranged themselves slightly, the way people do when an event they expected to be peripheral turns out to be the main event. Clara was watching Eleanor with an expression that had moved past apology into something more complex, part surprise, part something that might have been reassessment. Eleanor met her eyes briefly and then looked away. She didn't need the reassessment. She hadn't needed anyone's assessment in a long time. What she needed was information. She had been chosen. She did not yet know what that meant. The town of Black Ridge, Montana, in April of 1882 was not what the advertisements called it when they were recruiting settlers and investors and wives for lonely mountain men. The advertisement said growing. The advertisement said opportunity. What Black Ridge actually was, Eleanor understood within about 40 minutes of walking its main street, was a place where people had come for reasons and stayed past the reasons, and where the infrastructure of civilization had been assembled in the order of urgency rather than planning. A saloon, then a general store, then a blacksmith, then, sometime later and almost apologetically, a church and a school. The buildings were mostly wood, mostly recent, and several of them were still being argued into shape by men who had more ambition than lumber. She walked beside Gideon Wolfe through this town, and she kept her own pace, which was not slow, and he adjusted to it without comment. That was the first concrete thing she noted about him, filed next to the fact that he had paid more than the arrangement fee without explaining why. He did not try to control the pace. He matched it. He was not a talking man. She had gathered this from the depot, and it was confirmed in the first 100 yards. He did not fill silence, did not offer observations about the town or the weather or what he expected from her. Most men, she had found, filled silence with themselves, their histories, their plans, their opinions about things that didn't require opinions. Gideon Wolfe was quiet in a way that felt like policy rather than rudeness. He was quiet the way a person is quiet when they have learned that most things said are not worth the breath. She did not mind quiet. She had spent 31 years learning to live inside it. What she did mind, and she was honest with herself about it, was not knowing. She was a person who oriented herself by information, and she was operating on almost none. "Your cabin," she said, as they passed the general store. "How far?" "Half a day's ride, in good conditions." "And current conditions?" A pause. "Adequate." She absorbed this. "What does it consist of?" "The cabin?" "Yes." 3 rooms, functional. It hasn't had a woman in it." A shorter pause. "It hasn't had anyone but me." "How long?" 6 years. She did the arithmetic on what a cabin occupied by one solitary man for 6 years was likely to look like. She had cleaned worse. She had managed worse. This was not what worried her. What worried her was something she couldn't quite articulate yet, something in the gap between the man she was walking beside and the situation she had walked into, a gap shaped like the words "I know" spoken to a woman he had supposedly just met. She let it sit. She was good at letting things sit when she didn't have enough information to do anything useful with them. They reached the far end of the main street where a livery stable slouched against a corral, and Gideon Wolf went inside and came out leading a horse pulling a wagon. He had already, apparently, made arrangements. He had already, apparently, anticipated that she would come with him today rather than being delivered later. He knew her name before she told him. He had already arranged the wagon. He had paid more than the fee without explaining why. Eleanor Hart climbed onto the wagon seat and looked straight ahead at the mountains, which were very large and very indifferent, and she told herself firmly, the way she told herself things when she needed them to be true long enough to act on them, that she was a practical woman in a practical situation, and that the important thing was to gather information, and that she would have time to gather it. The wagon rolled out of Black Ridge, and the town shrank behind them, and the mountains grew larger, and Gideon Wolf drove in silence, and Eleanor sat beside him in the cold and thought about what she knew and what she didn't. She knew she was unwanted. She had always known that. It had been the central organizing fact of her life since she was old enough to understand that bodies were graded, that some passed inspection and some did not, that the world reserved its warmth for specific shapes and sizes and faces, and that her particular arrangement of self did not qualify. She knew what it felt like to be used, not dramatically, not violently, but in the ordinary grinding way, the way her previous employer had kept her on at half wage because she needed the work. And he knew it, the way the boarding house landlady had given her the worst room and justified it to herself with logic that was never examined, the way people made decisions about her without including her in the deciding. She did not yet know what this was. She didn't know if the man sitting 18 inches to her left had chosen her from pity or cruelty or some calculation she hadn't figured out yet, or something else entirely. She didn't know what the cabin would be like, or what he would expect from her, or whether she had the capacity to be what was expected. What she did know, and she was honest with herself about this too, even though the honesty was uncomfortable, was that when he had pointed at her, when he had said that one and refused to be moved from it, she had felt something crack open in the center of her chest, something she had spent years sealing shut because it was safer sealed. The particular treacherous hope of being seen. She was angry at herself for feeling it. She was not naive enough to think hope was the same as truth, but she felt it, and she filed that away too, alongside everything else. The road climbed into the foothills, and the pines closed in on either side, and the sky above them went from wide and pale to a narrower strip of gray, and the cold deepened by about 5 degrees. Eleanor adjusted her coat and kept her hands in her lap, and did not ask how much farther, because she had already asked once about the distance, and she was not going to be that kind of woman. About 2 hours into the ride, Gideon Wolf said, without preamble, "You can ask." She looked at him. His eyes were on the road. "Ask what?" she said. "Whatever you've been working through for the last 2 hours." She considered this. "What makes you think I've been working through something?" "The way you sit when you're thinking." He said it flatly, without embellishment. "You go very still." This bothered her more than it should have, because it implied a level of observation she wasn't expecting. You don't observe a person's stillness unless you've been watching them long enough to establish a baseline. They had known each other for approximately 3 hours. "Why did you choose me?" she said. Not a question exactly. A statement with a blank at the end. The pause was long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Because I knew who you were," he said. "We'd never met." "No." "Then how did you know who I was?" The road curved around an outcrop of rock, and on the other side the valley opened briefly before narrowing again, and far above them she could see the dark geometry of what she assumed was the cabin against the tree line. "I'll tell you," he said, "when you're ready to hear it." "I'm ready now." "No," he said, with the same flat certainty he applied to most things. "You're not. You've been here 3 hours. You're still deciding whether you trust the ground you're standing on." He didn't look at her. "Wait until you've been in the cabin a week. Then ask me again." She wanted to argue with this. She had a complete counter-argument assembled in her mind. That she was 31 years old and not a child who needed to be managed. That she had a right to information about the circumstances of her own life. That the mysterious on-principle approach was a posture she had no patience for. She didn't deliver the counter-argument. Because he wasn't wrong. She was still deciding whether to trust the ground, and she knew it, and she hated that he knew it too. But she wasn't going to lie about the truth just to win a point. A week, she said. A week, he agreed. The cabin, when they reached it, was exactly what he had described. 3 rooms, functional. The functional doing a lot of work in that sentence. The main room had a stone fireplace and a table and 2 chairs and a cot in the corner that she assumed was not where he had been sleeping. She found the actual sleeping room off the back, a narrow space with a proper bed frame and a mattress that had seen better years. The 3rd room was storage, tools, traps, provisions, things organized with the tight efficiency of a man who had lived alone long enough to have systems. It was also dirty, in the specific way of a space where one person has been managing necessary maintenance and nothing more. Not catastrophic, not unsalvageable, just honest. She stood in the middle of the main room and looked at it for a long moment. "I'll need a mop," she said. "Storage room, left side. And something for the smell in the corner by the window." A pause. "I wasn't sure you'd notice." "I notice things." The smallest thing happened at the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile. It was too minor and too brief to be called a smile. But it was the first crack in the absolute stillness of his face since she'd met him, and she noticed that too. She got the mop. The first 3 days were a study in adjustment. She learned the cabin's particular challenges, the way the floorboards near the fire warped in heat and needed to be weighted down to keep from cupping, the window in the storage room that didn't close completely and required a specific wedge of folded leather to seal against the wind, the way the chimney drew better if you started the fire small and built it, rather than piling on wood immediately. These were the things a space taught you if you paid attention, and Eleanor paid attention. She also learned things about Gideon Wolf. He rose before dawn, always. I was quiet about it, which she appreciated, though she was also a light sleeper and heard him anyway. He ate practical food without apparent preference, whatever was available, whatever required the least fuss. He was clean, which surprised her less than it might have, because there was a kind of rigor in the way he organized his space that extended to himself. He was out of the cabin most of each day, managing the trap lines and whatever other business the mountains required of him. And when he returned in the evenings, he was tired in a physical, uncomplicated way, and he ate what she had made. She had started cooking because it gave her something to do, and because the alternative was watching him eat salt pork straight from the pan. And he said the first evening, without looking up from the plate, "This is better than what I make." It was not effusive praise, but she had not been expecting effusive praise. "That's a low bar," she said. "It is," he agreed. By the 4th day, she had cleaned the cabin to a standard she could live with. She had reorganized the storage room to make it more efficient, not rearranging his systems but improving them. And she had shown him the changes, and he had looked at them for a long moment and said, "That's better," in the same tone he applied to most things, which was the tone of a man who said what he meant and nothing extra. By the 6th day, she had decided she could be here. It wasn't warmth, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but it was survivable in a way that reached toward more than surviving, and she was willing to work with that. On the 7th day, she found the letters. She had been cleaning under the floorboards, specifically the boards near the window that needed to be lifted to check the wedge she had placed to level them. She lifted the boards, and the wedge was fine, and she started to replace them, and her fingers hit something in the gap beneath that was not part of the floor. She pulled it out. It was a bundle of papers, tied with cord, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp. She sat back on her heels and held it, and even before she untied the cord, she felt the quality of her attention shift, that specific internal gravity that meant something mattered, something changed. She untied the cord. She unfolded the oilcloth. Inside were letters, 15, 20 of them, each in an envelope, each sealed, each addressed to the same name in the same careful, deliberate handwriting. Addressed to her. Eleanor Hart, 14 Morrow Street, Cleveland, Ohio. She did not open them immediately. She sat on the cold floor with them in her hands, and she breathed very carefully, because her chest had done something uncooperative, and she needed a moment before she was ready to understand what she was looking at. Then she opened the first one. It was dated 3 years ago, February of 1879, and it began, "I don't know if this is something a man like me does, but I've been trying to figure out how to start it for 2 months, and I haven't managed anything better than just starting it, so I'm starting it." She read it twice. Then she read the second one, the third. She lost track of how many she read before she registered the sound of the cabin door and looked up. Gideon Wolf stood in the doorway. He was still in his coat. I was looking at the papers in her hands with the expression of a man who has miscalculated something and is recalibrating in real time. You said a week, Eleanor said. Her voice was very steady. She was proud of how steady it was, given what was happening in her chest. Yes, he said. It's been a week. She held up the letters. So, he came inside slowly and closed the door behind him, and the silence stretched between them like ice over deep water, present, functional, not yet tested. You've read them, he said. Some of them. Not all. She looked at the bundle in her hands. These were under the floor. I know. You wrote these? Yes. 3 years ago, before we met. She kept her eyes on his face. Before today, I mean. Yes. The fire had gone low. Neither of them moved to tend it. You said you knew who I was, Eleanor said. At the depot, you said you knew. She looked back at the letters. These are not the letters of a man who saw a woman at a depot and recognized her. These are... She stopped. She was not sure what they were yet. She was not going to name them before she was sure. Who are you? She said. Tell me who you actually are. And something outside the cabin, in the darkening yard, moved. And then a boot hit the porch step, and then another, and then the sound of more than one person, and the knock on the door was not the knock of someone who expected to be refused. Eleanor looked at Gideon. His face had changed. The stillness was gone, replaced by something colder and more alert, the face of a man who had been expecting this and had been hoping to be wrong. Get back, he said quietly. Back corner, now. She did not move. Who is it? The knock came again, harder. Eleanor. His voice was very quiet and very serious. Please. She stood up from the floor and she looked at the letters in her hands, and she looked at the door, and somewhere in the distance a wind came down off the mountain like a warning, and the fire guttered in the draft from the window, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes when the thing you couldn't name suddenly names itself, that she had walked into something much larger than a cabin in Montana, and it had been waiting for her to arrive. The knock came a third time, and this time it didn't stop at knocking. The door opened. Eleanor had not moved to the back corner. She had not moved at all. She was standing in the middle of the room with a bundle of unsent letters in her hands and 3 years of someone else's secret against her chest. And when the door swung inward, she turned to face it with the same steadiness she had been assembling her entire life out of whatever materials were available. 2 men came in first. They were the kind of men who enter rooms ahead of whoever sent them, large, deliberate, arranged for effect. They stopped just inside the threshold, one on each side of the door, and behind them came a third man who was not large in the same physical way, but who carried himself as though size were a matter of will rather than body. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed by frontier standards, which meant his coat was clean, and his boots were good leather, and his hat had not been slept in. His face was the face of a man who had spent considerable time arranging it into an expression of pleasant authority, and who had been doing this long enough that the arrangement had become structural. He looked at Gideon first, a fast, assessing look, and then he looked at Eleanor, and the pleasantness in his face shifted by a fraction, adjusted, recalibrated. Miss Hart, he said, as though he had been expecting her to be standing in that specific spot. She felt the cold move through her, different from the cold outside, sharper and more specific. You have the advantage, she said. Her voice was level. She was getting very good at keeping it level. Forgive me. The man took his hat off, a gesture of courtesy so practiced it had no warmth in it. Victor Ashcroft. I believe we have some mutual acquaintances. Gideon had not moved from where he stood near the door. He had gone very still in the way she was beginning to recognize. Not the stillness of a man at rest, but the stillness of a man deciding what to do with his hands in the next 10 seconds. Victor, Gideon said. The name came out flat, stripped of everything. Gideon. Ashcroft looked around the cabin with the unhurried attention of a man inspecting a property he intends to acquire. You've made improvements. What do you want? What I've always wanted. Ashcroft's eyes came back to Gideon. The pleasantness in his face thinned slightly, the way paint thins when you apply too much pressure. A conversation, a reasonable conversation between men who have history. We don't have history, Gideon said. We have a disagreement. A 7-year disagreement is history. Ashcroft moved further into the room, unhurried, and one of the two large men shifted slightly with him, maintaining a specific geometry. May I sit? He sat down in one of the chairs without waiting for the answer. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that was not small at all. Eleanor stood with the letters in her hands, and she watched this, and she made herself be very still and very quiet, and she paid attention, because she was in a room with a man who had just called her by her name before she'd told it to him, and she needed to understand what that meant. Miss Hart, Ashcroft said, addressing her now with a collegial warmth that was entirely manufactured. Please don't be alarmed. This is a private matter between Mr. Wolfe and myself, and I regret that you've been caught in the middle of it. I'm standing in a room, Eleanor said, not caught in the middle of anything. Ashcroft looked at her for a moment. The recalibration again, something adjusting behind his eyes. Of course, he said. Forgive me. He did not sound like he thought there was anything to forgive. Gideon had not sat. He was standing near the fireplace and his hands were at his sides, and Eleanor, watching him, understood that he had made a decision about those hands and was holding to it by considerable effort. You're not here for a conversation, Gideon said. I'm here because you didn't respond to my letters. I burned your letters. Yes, I assumed as much. Ashcroft crossed one leg over the other, unhurried. Which leaves us here, in person. Which I prefer, honestly. Some things need to be handled in person. What things? Eleanor said. Both men looked at her. She had not been addressing either one of them specifically. She had been addressing the room, the situation, the specific quality of dishonesty that was filling the cabin like wood smoke. The letters under the floor, she continued. She held them up. These are addressed to me. Written to me. By you. She looked at Gideon. Before we met. She looked at Ashcroft. And you walked in here knowing my name, so whatever is happening, I am already in the middle of it, and I would like someone to say something true. The silence in the cabin had a particular texture. Outside, the wind was moving through the pines, and far off something called once and went quiet. Ashcroft looked at Gideon with a slight smile that was the most genuinely expressive thing his face had done. You didn't tell her, Ashcroft said. I was going to, Gideon said. When? Tonight. Ah. Ashcroft set his hat on the table with a careful precision. Well, then I suppose I'll let you. He said it the way a man pulls out a chair for someone, a performance of courtesy that was actually an assertion of control. He was giving Gideon permission. In Gideon's own cabin, with Gideon's own information. Eleanor watched Gideon take that in. She watched him absorb it and hold it and not respond to it, because responding to it was what Ashcroft wanted. Not tonight, Gideon said, not with you in the room. I'm afraid tonight is the only option available. Ashcroft unfolded his hands. I've ridden a considerable distance. My patience for waiting another decade while you— Sit down, Gideon said to Eleanor. She almost objected on principle. She was tired of being managed, and she had been managed all day, and the instinct to resist was immediate and strong. But she looked at his face and she made the calculation. Not submission, calculation. And she sat down in the second chair. Gideon pulled a stool from near the fire and sat on it, elbows on his knees, and he looked at the floor for a moment, and then he looked at Eleanor, and his face was doing something that she hadn't seen it do before. The stillness was still there, but underneath it something was shifting, the way ice shifts in late March when the temperature goes up, and the surface looks intact but the structure has changed. I knew your name, he said, because I knew you. Not personally. I knew who you were before you knew I existed. He stopped. He was clearly not a man who explained himself often, and he was struggling with the machinery of it. 9 years ago, I was working a stable in Cleveland, Hargrove Stable, on the east side. You know it? She knew it. She had passed it twice a day for 3 years on the way to the factory. She nodded. I was nobody there. I was the man they hired when they couldn't fill the shift with someone better. I was the man they underpaid because they could. He said it without bitterness, just fact. One afternoon in November, it was cold, raining, I had an incident with the owner. He accused me of stealing grain. I hadn't stolen anything. But he had 2 other men say they'd seen me, and he had reasons to want me gone, and I had no one to say otherwise. Eleanor was very still. The kind of still she went when things mattered. He was going to have me arrested, Gideon said. He'd sent someone for the sheriff. I was standing in the yard in the rain, and I had nothing, no money, no one who knew me, no way to make anyone listen. He looked at his hands. You came through the yard. You were cutting through, the way people did. You saw what was happening. He stopped. You stopped. She searched her memory. 9 years ago. November rain. She had been 22. She had cut through Hargrove's yard 4 or 5 times a week because it saved 8 minutes on the walk to the factory. She did not remember him specifically. She remembered the situation, vaguely, the shape of it. A man standing in the rain, someone shouting, and her own instinctive discomfort with the quality of the shouting, the particular tone of a man who knew he had the power and was enjoying using it. You asked what happened, Gideon said. I told you. You went inside and you told Hargrove that you'd seen me working the north stall all afternoon because you walked past it every day, and you'd have noticed if I'd been near the grain stores. He looked up. It wasn't true. You'd never been inside the stable. It might have been true, she said slowly. I don't remember specifically. It wasn't true and you knew it and you said it anyway. His voice had not changed in register, but something in it had. They let me go. Hargrove didn't believe you entirely, but he couldn't prove you were lying, and having a woman involved made the whole thing complicated, and he let it go. A pause. I left Cleveland 6 months later. I came out here. I built what I built. But I never... He stopped again, started again. You didn't even look at me after. You just walked away. Like it was nothing. Eleanor sat with this for a moment. A man who had carried 9 years of one unremarkable afternoon in November rain. An afternoon she had not remembered. The letters, she said, I wrote them. I never sent them. He rubbed one hand over his face. I knew where you lived. I kept track, I had a contact in Cleveland who would check on things periodically, and I asked him to include information about you. It wasn't strange behavior, at the time. He sounded unconvinced by his own defense. I wanted to thank you. I kept meaning to thank you. And then years went on, and it seemed... He stopped. It seemed like something else. Something else, Eleanor repeated. I knew about the boarding house, he said. I knew about the factory work. I knew when your mother died. He said it straight, not flinching from what he knew it sounded like. And I knew about him. His eyes moved to Ashcroft, who had been sitting very quietly through all of this with the expression of a man watching a play he had staged himself. What he did to you. She felt the cold again, the specific cold. What do you know about that? She said. Her voice had changed and she knew it and couldn't help it. I know he owned the factory, Gideon said. I know he raised the rent on the boarding house through a man he had doing property management on the east side. I know your wage was cut twice in 2 years, and both times the authorization came from him. He was watching her face. I know you were pushed out of Cleveland, Eleanor. I just didn't know until recently that it wasn't coincidence. She turned her head and looked at Victor Ashcroft. He had not moved. He was watching her with an attention that was now uncloaked, the pleasantness stripped away to something more honest and considerably less comfortable to look at. Why? She said. One word. Because, Ashcroft said pleasantly, of where you're sitting right now. He let that settle. He was the kind of man who appreciated the effect of a well-timed pause. You were useful to him, he said, nodding toward Gideon. In Cleveland. You gave him an alibi when I needed him to stay vulnerable, when I needed him to have no one defending him. He said it with the clean detachment of someone describing a strategy rather than a cruelty. I've been looking for Gideon Wolfe for 7 years. Or more precisely, I've been looking for what Gideon Wolfe has built in these mountains. He had the considerable inconvenience of being very difficult to get to. A slight smile. You, however, I was easier, Eleanor said. You were the key, Ashcroft said. He said it like a compliment. The room had gone quiet enough that she could hear the fire eating its own wood. She sat with this information and she turned it over and she looked at its edges and she did not do any of the things she felt like doing, which was several things in quick succession that she did not have time for. She did not cry. She was not built for crying in front of people who had engineered her suffering, and she was especially not built for crying in front of a man who would interpret it as confirmation of effectiveness. You drove me west, she said. On purpose, to get to him. "And here you are," Ashcroft said. "And here I am." She looked down at the letters in her hands. Then she looked at Gideon. "You knew this was a possibility, that he might use me as a route." Gideon's jaw tightened. "I suspected it. When I understood what he'd done to you, the factory, the rent, I understood that he was moving you deliberately, and that meant he had found out about the fact that I knew of you." He stopped. "I came to the depot to get you out of his reach, to make it so that using you to get to me required going through me first. By marrying me. By keeping you safe. Marriage was, yes." She looked at him for a long moment. She could feel Ashcroft watching her feel this, which was its own kind of violation, and she managed it by setting the feeling aside, not suppressing it, just placing it somewhere interior where it could exist without being visible. "What does he want?" she said. "The actual thing." "My land," Gideon said. "The claim I filed 7 years ago covers 400 acres that include 2 mining veins and 3 creek tributaries. The creek rights alone are worth more than everything else combined." He didn't look at Ashcroft. "He's been trying to acquire the adjacent claims through men who work for him, to surround mine on 3 sides and create a legal dispute about the boundaries. He needs me out of the way, dead or dispossessed, to make the boundary claims stick." Eleanor absorbed this. She looked at Ashcroft. "And you thought," she said, "that coming here with 2 men would accomplish that." "I thought," Ashcroft said, "that coming here with a reasonable offer would accomplish it. The men are a formality." He spread his hands in a gesture of openness that she suspected he had practiced. "I'm offering Gideon a fair price for the claim, a new life somewhere easier, and a guaranteed future for himself and," his eyes moved to her briefly, "for his wife, should he choose to take it." "And if he doesn't choose to take it," Eleanor said. Ashcroft looked at her with something that was almost respect. She had asked the right question, and he appreciated efficient people even when they were inconvenient. "Then things become complicated," he said. "For everyone." Gideon stood up from the stool. The 2 large men near the door shifted. The geometry of the room changed. "Get out," Gideon said to Ashcroft. "Gideon, you've said what you came to say. Now get out." Ashcroft picked up his hat from the table and stood, unhurried, in the particular way of a man who is leaving because he has decided to, not because he has been asked to. "I'll be in Black Ridge for 3 days," he said. "The offer stands until Friday." He put his hat on. After Friday, he left the conditional unfinished, which was deliberate, because an unspecified threat occupied more mental space than a specified one. He nodded to Eleanor with the courtesy performance fully reinstalled. "Miss Hart." A pause. "Or I suppose Mrs. Wolfe." He walked to the door. The 2 large men followed him. The door closed. The cabin held the silence for a beat. 2. The fire popped. "How many men does he have?" Eleanor said. Gideon turned from the door. The question had surprised him. She could see that. He had been expecting something else from her first. Anger, maybe. Or tears, which she had already decided against. "In town, probably 4 or 5, he said. "He's cautious with resources." "And the legal claim," she said. "The boundary dispute. How far along is it?" "He's filed 2 complaints with the Territory Land Office. I've responded to both." He sat back down on the stool heavily. "My paperwork is solid, but paperwork needs someone willing to look at it." "Who's the land agent?" "Man named Pritchard. He's in Helena." "Is Pritchard Ashcroft's man?" "I don't know. I've never met him." Eleanor looked at the letters in her hands. Then she set them on the table between them, not discarding them, just setting them down in the way you set down something you intend to return to, and she folded her hands in her lap. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes. From the beginning, at the depot. I know. You put me in a situation without giving me information I needed to make decisions," she said. "That's not, regardless of your reasons, that's not how I work, Gideon. I need information." "Yes," he said. "I know that now." "You knew it before. You watched me for long enough." She said it without accusation, just precision. "You wrote letters for 3 years saying you knew who I was. That's knowing." He looked at the floor. His hands were between his knees. He was, she realized, not comfortable with this. Not uncomfortable in the way of a man performing contrition, but genuinely uncomfortable in the way of a man who had made a decision that made sense inside his own head and was now reckoning with the fact that it had not been made inside only his own head. "I was afraid," he said. Quiet. Flat. Like a man reporting a fact that costs something to report. "That if I told you everything at the start, you would make a different choice." "That was my choice to make," she said. "Yes." A pause. "It was." The acknowledgement sat between them, honest and insufficient, and all he had. She picked the letters back up. She squared the edges of the bundle against her knee. "The fortune," she said. "The thing Ashcroft is after. What is it actually worth?" Gideon looked up. Something moved behind his eyes. "More than he knows," Gideon said. "How much more?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was deciding something. "Enough that if it were under your name," he said, "it would be legally unreachable by him. He can contest a single man's land claim. He can't contest a married woman's inheritance documentation. The laws are different." He looked at her steadily. "I had a lawyer in Helena draw up the papers 6 months ago." Eleanor was very still. 6 months ago," she said. "Yes." "Before we met?" "Yes." She looked at the letters. She looked at him. She looked at the bundle of paper in her hands that represented 3 years of a man she hadn't known writing words he'd never sent. The 3-year-long interior conversation of someone who had been carrying one afternoon in November rain like it was something sacred. "This is a great deal of information," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know." She stood up. She went to the fire and put 2 pieces of wood on it and stood with her back to him for a moment while the flames adjusted. Outside, the wind had picked up and she could hear it moving around the corners of the cabin, testing the walls the way it always did after dark. She thought about Cleveland. She thought about the factory floor and the particular cold of that building in winter, the way the machines vibrated through the floorboards into your feet until your whole body hummed with it by the end of a shift. She thought about the rent going up and the wage going down, and the arithmetic of survival that she had run in her head every month for years, without knowing that the numbers were being moved by someone else's hand. She thought about sitting on the train from Chicago, tired in every layer of herself, telling herself she would find out what she had bought with her mother's sewing kit. She was finding out. "He'll come back," she said, still facing the fire. "Ashcroft. Not in 3 days. Before that. Probably." "He didn't come all this way for a conversation." She turned around. "He came to see the setup, the cabin, where everything is. He'll be back with a plan and it'll be sooner than Friday." Gideon looked at her with the stillness that she had begun to understand was not the absence of expression, but the fullest expression he was capable of. "Yes," he said. "I think so too." "Then we need to do the paperwork," she said. "The transfer to my name. If the lawyer is already in Helena, how long to get the documents here?" 4 days if I send a rider tomorrow morning. Send one tonight." He was quiet for a moment. "It's dark," he said, "and cold." "I know it's dark and cold." She sat back down. "Send one anyway." He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back at him, and whatever he was seeing in her face, she didn't know what it was, she couldn't see it, seemed to settle something in him. He nodded once, a short, definitive movement. "I'll send Carrie from the next claim over," he said. "He owes me." "Good." She picked up the letters again. "And I'm going to read the rest of these." He didn't object. He stood up and put his coat back on and went to the door. "Eleanor," he said. She looked up. "I'm sorry," he said, "for not telling you, for putting you in a position where—" He stopped, started again. "I made decisions about your life without asking you. I know what that is. I know what it costs." She held his gaze. She was not ready to make it easier for him, and she was honest enough with herself to know that, and she thought he was honest enough to understand it. "Go get your writer," she said. He went. She sat by the fire with 20 letters in her hands, and she read them in order, from the oldest to the most recent, and what she found in them was not what she would have built if she were constructing the story herself. They were not romantic in any smooth sense. They were awkward in places. They were the letters of a man who had something to say and kept starting over, who wrote himself into circles and crossed out lines and started again. In the 4th letter he wrote, "I don't know what I'm doing," and then crossed it out and then wrote it again below as if crossing it out had not resolved the issue. In the seventh letter, he wrote things about loneliness that she recognized from the inside, the specific kind of loneliness that wasn't about other people, but about the distance between who you were and who you could be if the circumstances permitted. In the 15th letter, the most recent one, dated 8 months ago, he wrote, "I've made the arrangements. The lawyer has the documents. I'm going to the depot in the spring. I don't know what you'll think of any of this. You probably won't come. Or you'll come and you'll take one look at me in the cabin and leave on the next wagon. You're practical. I've always known you were practical. But I keep thinking about how you walked away after, like it cost you nothing, like being decent was so natural for you. It didn't even require acknowledgement. I've spent 9 years trying to get to that. I haven't quite made it. But I'm still trying. I think I'm still trying because of that afternoon in the rain." She put the letters down when she finished. She sat with her hands in her lap and the fire warm on her face and outside the wind still working at the corners. And she stayed there long enough for the logs to burn down to coals before she heard Gideon's boots on the porch, and the door opened and he came back inside, bringing the cold with him. He saw her sitting at the table with the letters in front of her. He said nothing. "The writer?" she asked. "Gone. He'll be in Helena by tomorrow night." She nodded. She stood up, picked up the letters, and set them on the shelf above the fireplace. Not hidden, not discarded. Set down in a place where things that mattered were kept. "We'll need a plan for when Ashcroft comes back," she said. "Not a fighting plan, a legal one. Documentation, filed copies, witnesses in town who can attest to the timeline." She turned around. "I can organize that. I'm good at organizing." "I know you are," he said. "Stop knowing things about me before I tell you," she said. "It's unsettling." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but it was there. "I'll try," he said. She looked at him in the firelight, at the scars she hadn't asked about, and the hands that had built this place out of raw mountain and years of solitary effort, and the face that had watched her at a depot with a specificity that she now understood entirely differently than she had 9 hours ago, and she filed away one more thing. He was not what she had expected. None of this was what she had expected. But she had not come all this way, had not sold everything she had left of her mother, to retreat from a thing because it was more complicated than advertised. She pulled her chair closer to the fire and sat down. "Tell me everything you know about Victor Ashcroft," she said. "Everything, from the beginning." And Gideon Wolfe sat down across from her, and outside the mountain held them in its cold and indifferent keeping, and he told her. Gideon talked for 2 hours. He was not a natural storyteller. He organized information the way he organized his storage room, in order of utility rather than drama. But Eleanor did not need drama. She needed sequence and causation and specificity, and he gave her those. She asked questions where the logic had gaps. He filled them. By the time the fire had burned down to a steady low burn and the mountain outside had gone fully dark and silent, she understood the shape of what they were inside. Victor Ashcroft had come west in 1874 with capital from Eastern investors and a talent for identifying what other men had found and figuring out how to take it from them legally, or close enough to legally that the difference was academic. He had done this in Wyoming first, a series of mining claim acquisitions that involved boundary disputes, surveying irregularities, and at least 2 cases where the original claimants had simply disappeared, which the territorial authorities had investigated with the thoroughness of men who understood who was funding the local economy. He had moved to Montana in 1878 with more capital and a more refined method. Gideon had filed his claim in 1876 before Ashcroft arrived. He had spent a year in these mountains before that, learning the terrain, identifying the veins, understanding the water. He was methodical in the way that people who have had nothing are methodical. He did not take risks. He hadn't mapped first, and he documented everything, dated and signed and witnessed where he could find witnesses, which in the high mountains was not always easy, but which he had managed. When Ashcroft's men started acquiring adjacent land in 1879, Gideon had understood what was happening before the first formal complaint was filed, and he had sent his documentation to a lawyer in Helena and then gone very quiet and very patient in the way he had learned to be quiet and patient. The problem was not the documentation. The problem was that documentation required someone to look at it, and looking at it required someone to not be afraid of Victor Ashcroft, and that was a smaller population than it should have been. "Pritchard," Eleanor said, "the land agent." "I don't know if he's been bought or just convinced," Gideon said. "There's a difference in terms of what we can do." There's also a difference in terms of what he's risked, Eleanor said. A man who's been bought knows he's broken the law. A man who's been convinced can be unconvinced. She had her hands around a cup of coffee she had made somewhere in the middle of Gideon's accounting. She had needed something to do with her hands, and he had not objected. Do you have copies of all your filed documents? In the strongbox under the bed, and copies with the lawyer and Helena. Good. When the papers come back from Helena, the transfer documents, we file copies in two places. Helena and the county seat. Not just one. Two separate jurisdictions means Ashcroft would need to compromise two separate sets of officials to make the paperwork disappear. She set the cup down. And we need witnesses to the filing, people whose names mean something. In Black Ridge, Gideon said, that's a short list. One is enough, she said. It just needs to be the right one. She went to bed that night with her mind still running, and she slept badly, which was not unusual for her in new places, and she was awake before Gideon the next morning for the first time since she had arrived. She stood at the window in the cold pre-dawn and looked at the mountains that were just beginning to separate from the darkness. And she thought about the factory floor in Cleveland and the arithmetic of survival, and she thought about all the months of reduced wages and increased rent that had not been coincidence, and she felt the anger move through her, clean, focused, the kind that didn't cloud judgment but sharpened it. She had made biscuits by the time Gideon appeared from the back room, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her and then at the table with the particular expression of a man recalibrating what mornings were going to be now. I need you to tell me who in Black Ridge is trustworthy, she said. Not your friends. I mean people who have stood for something when it cost them. He sat down and thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. He didn't name people reflexively or out of loyalty. He named the general store owner, a man named Hartwell, who had refused to extend credit to Ashcroft's surveying crew last spring when they'd tried to establish a tab without Ashcroft's direct authorization. He named the town's single female property owner, a woman who ran the laundry and had been in Black Ridge longer than almost anyone, and whose opinion was respected in the particular way of people who have outlasted everyone who doubted them. Her name is Margaret Sue, he said. She's been here since '73. She knows every piece of business that has passed through this town. I want to meet her, Eleanor said. She'll be in town, Gideon said. Then I'll go to town. He looked at her across the table. Ashcroft's men may still be there. Good, she said. Let them see me doing laundry. They went to Black Ridge the next morning. Eleanor wore her practical coat and her working boots, and she sat beside Gideon on the wagon seat with her hands in her lap, and she looked at the mountains the same way she had on the first day, except that now she knew more about what the mountains contained and what they were worth, and she was sorting information into categories, what she could act on, what she needed more data about, what she needed to simply wait on without letting the waiting make her passive. Black Ridge looked different in morning light than it had that first evening. Still rough, still provisional, but daylit and occupied, people moving on the main street with the purposeful energy of a place where there was work to do. Eleanor registered the layout. She always registered layouts, noting which buildings were substantial and which were makeshift, where the sightlines ran, which establishments were doing business. She also registered, without making it obvious that she was registering it, 2 men sitting on the steps of the saloon who were not doing anything in particular in the alert, unhurried way of men who have been placed there to observe. Ashcrofts. She did not know their names, but she knew their posture. She got down from the wagon without help. She had been doing this. And she told Gideon she would meet him at the general store in an hour, and she walked toward the laundry with the direct, unhurried step of a woman going about ordinary business. Margaret Sue was a compact woman, somewhere in her late 50s, with the kind of face that had started weathered and gotten more so in an interesting way, the lines in it arranged by experience rather than gravity. She was working a washboard when Eleanor came in, and she looked up without stopping. "You're Wolf's wife," she said, not a question. "Eleanor Hart," Eleanor said. "Or Wolf, I suppose, depending on the paperwork." "The paperwork matters a great deal in my experience." Margaret Sue straightened up and dried her hands. She looked at Eleanor with the direct, assessing attention of someone who had been reading people for decades and no longer bothered to disguise the fact that she was doing it. "What do you need?" Eleanor liked her immediately. She filed this as relevant information. "Information," Eleanor said, "and then maybe a favor. Though I want to give you the information first so you can decide about the favor with full knowledge. Margaret Sue looked at her for another moment, and then she pulled a stool from beside the work table and pointed at it, and she sat on an upturned crate herself, and Eleanor sat on the stool and told her what she knew. Not everything, not the letters, not the personal geography of how she had come to be here, but the legal structure of what Ashcroft was doing and what the documents from Helena would establish and what she needed in the way of a local witness to the filing. Margaret Sue listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. "Pritchard's the obstacle," Margaret said when Eleanor had finished. "He's not bought. He's scared. There's a difference." "I thought there might be," Eleanor said. "Is there anything behind the fear, something Ashcroft has on him?" "There's a land transaction in Pritchard's past that doesn't bear scrutiny," Margaret said. "Before he was land agent. He knows Ashcroft knows about it." She picked up the edge of her apron and turned it in her hands. "A man who's scared can be scared in more than one direction." "That's what I was thinking," Eleanor said. "What exactly would you need from me?" "Your signature as a witness to the transfer filing, and your willingness to say, if it ever became relevant, that you observed the filing taking place and that the document was what it claimed to be." "That's not a small thing," Margaret said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "I know it isn't. I wouldn't ask it if I had another option." Margaret Sue looked at her for a long time, in the way of someone running calculations that were more complex than the visible numbers. "He ran off 2 businesses I knew," she said finally, "through the same kind of boundary business. The Henderson's supply operation and Tom Carey's claim on the South Fork." She said it without drama, just setting it down between them as fact. "I signed a letter to the territorial governor about Tom Carey's case. The governor didn't respond." She looked at Eleanor steadily. "What makes you think this time is different?" "Because this time the title is in a woman's name, and the law treats that differently than a man's," Eleanor said. "And because we're filing in 2 places simultaneously, not one. And because—" She stopped, made a decision. "Because I'm not going to stop. Tom Carey probably stopped when the governor didn't respond. I won't stop." The word probably was unkind to Tom Carey, she thought immediately after saying it. She didn't know what Tom Carey had done or not done, but she let the sentence stand because it was the truest version of what she meant. Margaret Sue nodded a movement that reminded Eleanor unexpectedly of Gideon. "Bring me the papers when they arrive," Margaret said. "I'll sign." The rider came back from Helena on the 4th day, late afternoon, just as the light was going horizontal through the pine trees and the temperature was beginning its daily sharp descent. He handed Gideon a leather document case, and Gideon brought it inside and set it on the table, and they opened it together. The documents were what the lawyer had promised: transfer of title and claim rights from Gideon Wolfe to Eleanor Hart Wolfe, properly witnessed in Helena by 2 officers of the court and notarized under territorial seal. There were 3 copies. There was also a letter from the lawyer that Gideon read and then handed to Eleanor without comment. The letter said that an inquiry had been received in the Helena Land Office regarding the Wolfe Claim Boundary Survey, originating from a petitioner named Ashcroft, and that the inquiry had been assigned to Agent Pritchard, and that the lawyer had taken the liberty of sending Pritchard a preliminary notice that an amended title document was being prepared and would be filed within the week. She read this twice. "He warned Ashcroft," she said. "He warned Pritchard," Gideon said, "to give him the option to delay the inquiry before it became a formal proceeding, which gives Ashcroft time to move." She set the letter down. "How much time do we have?" "The preliminary notice was sent 3 days ago." She did the calculation. "He may already be on his way back." Gideon looked at the window. The light through the glass was the particular shade of late afternoon that was also the particular shade of bad timing. "We go to town first thing tomorrow," he said, "before he can get to us." "Tonight," Eleanor said. "Eleanor, it's 2 hours. The documents need to be filed and witnessed tonight." She was already moving, picking up the document case. "If Ashcroft arrives tomorrow morning and we haven't filed, we've lost the advantage. If we file tonight, he arrives and the thing is already done." Gideon looked at her. She could see him running the same calculations, arriving at the same answer, not liking it any better than she did, but recognizing that the dislike was not relevant. "Get your coat," he said. They rode to Black Ridge in the dark, which was cold and loud with wind, and occasionally alarming in the way that mountain roads at night are alarming, and they went directly to Margaret Sue's establishment, where the light was still burning. Margaret came to the door in a work apron and did not appear surprised to see them at this hour, and she signed all 3 copies of the documents with the careful, exact signature of someone who understood the weight of a signature, and Gideon signed as grantor, and Eleanor signed as recipient, and Margaret's employee, a young woman who was eating supper at the back table, signed as second witness without asking many questions. Margaret kept 1 copy. Eleanor and Gideon took the other 2 and went to the county recorder's office, which was closed but whose recorder, a thin, anxious man named Wills, answered the door after 5 minutes of knocking and accepted the filing with the bewildered compliance of a man who had been woken from sleep and was too disoriented to refuse. "Stamped and logged," Eleanor said, watching him work. "Both copies, date and time." Wills looked at her. "Please," she added. He stamped and logged both copies. They rode back to the cabin in the continuing dark and cold, and Eleanor sat on the wagon seat with 1 copy of the filed documents inside her coat against her body, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not safety, not victory, but the specific satisfaction of having done the thing that needed doing before the window closed. She was almost warm for the first time since she had come to Montana. The next morning broke clear and cold, and they were eating breakfast when they heard the horses. Not 1 horse, several. Coming up the mountain road with the purposeful speed of people who had not taken the night to rest. Gideon pushed back from the table. "How many?" Eleanor said. He went to the window. 4 horses, 5 men. More than last time. She set down her fork. She looked around the cabin. The document copy on the shelf above the fireplace, next to the letters. The strongbox under the bed. The cast-iron skillet on the stove that she had been about to use for eggs. "The papers are filed," she said. "Whatever he says, whatever he threatens, the papers are filed and witnessed and logged." "Yes," Gideon said. "So he can't take the land through legal maneuvering, not anymore." That was always the cleanest version of what he wanted, Gideon said. He was still at the window. "He has other versions." She understood what he meant. She picked up the skillet from the stove and set it on the table within reach, and she thought that this was perhaps an absurd gesture, a cast-iron skillet against 5 men, but she had spent 31 years being told her gestures were absurd, and she had developed a working theory that absurd gestures were sometimes the only kind available. The horses stopped outside, boots on the ground, several pairs. The particular sound of men organizing themselves before they knock, the brief pause, the repositioning, then the knock, which was more emphatic than last time. Gideon opened it before the second knock. Ashcroft stood on the porch with his hat on and his coat buttoned in the particular controlled anger of a man who has received information he didn't want. Behind him were 4 men, not the same 2 from before, different men, more of them, with the specific build and attention of people who were not here for conversation. Ashcroft looked at Gideon for a moment and then looked past him into the cabin. And he looked at Eleanor standing at the table, and he looked at the document case that she had placed on the table where he could see it. "You filed last night," he said. "Yesterday evening," Eleanor said. 3 copies. County recorder's log, if you'd like to verify." Something moved through Ashcroft's face, too fast and too controlled to name, but she caught the edge of it. She had hit the thing she had been aiming at. He stepped inside without being asked. His men followed. The cabin became very full very quickly, and the geometry of 5 men against 2 in a 3-room space was a different geometry than before, and Eleanor felt it in the same way she had felt the cold finding the seams of her coat, factually, without drama, filing it away. "The filing is an obstacle," Ashcroft said, "not a resolution. These things can be contested." "These things can be contested," Eleanor agreed. "In court, under territorial law. With the filed documents, the notarized transfer, and 2 witnesses to the signing available to testify." She folded her hands on the table. "How long does that take, typically?" "I've been told 18 months, 2 years sometimes." Ashcroft looked at her with the expression of a man who had not expected to be having this specific conversation with this specific person. "You've been busy," he said. "I've had time," she said. "It's a long ride from Cleveland." One of his men shifted. Another moved slightly to the left toward Gideon. The geometry continued to adjust. "Mrs. Wolfe," Ashcroft said, and his voice had changed register, the pleasantness stripped further away. showing something beneath it that was more honest and considerably harder. I want to be clear with you. The legal question is one conversation, but these mountains are remote, and the law, out here, takes time to arrive. She understood the threat. It was not subtle. He was not bothering with subtlety because he had decided that subtlety had not been productive. She looked at him steadily. I grew up in a factory, she said. I've been threatened by men who had actual power over my life. You're threatening me with distance and inconvenience. She shook her head once. That's not enough. The man nearest to Gideon moved. Fast. Not telegraphed, just suddenly in motion. And Gideon was already turning, but the angle was bad. And Eleanor had less than a second, and she didn't think about it. She grabbed the skillet off the table and swung it in a single motion, connecting with the side of the man's head with a sound that was deeply unpleasant and completely unambiguous. The man went down hard against the wall. Not unconscious, he was making sounds, but substantially reorganized. Everyone in the cabin was still. Eleanor stood with the skillet in both hands and her heart going hard against her ribs, and she did not lower it. Gideon moved. In the half-second of stunned stillness that followed the skillet, he moved with the specific efficiency of a man who had been waiting for exactly this much space. And what followed was not elegant. It was not the choreographed kind of conflict that stories made of it. It was fast and loud and involved the table being knocked over and two men going down and one going backward through the doorway onto the porch. And it was the kind of thing that happened in the body before the mind had fully processed it. Eleanor backed against the wall and kept the skillet up, and watched the door and kept track of who was where with the same systematic attention she applied to other problems. Ashcroft had not moved. He was standing in the corner of the room, not by choice, by the accident of where he had been when everything started. And he was watching Gideon with an expression that was no longer controlled in any of its layers. It was over in under 2 minutes. 2 men were down inside. One was on the porch. One had made it to the yard and was staying there. Gideon was standing in the middle of the room, breathing hard with a split on his left cheekbone that was going to be ugly by tomorrow, and his coat half pulled from his shoulder. The cabin was quiet except for the breathing. Ashcroft looked at the room. He looked at his men, who were variously horizontal and vertical, but none of them in a position to be useful. He looked at Gideon. Then he looked at Eleanor, who was still against the wall with the skillet in her hands. This doesn't resolve anything, Ashcroft said. His voice was steady, which she had to admit was an impressive feat given what the room currently looked like. It resolves today, Eleanor said. He looked at her for a long moment. She had the impression he was genuinely seeing her, not recalibrating, not managing, but actually looking at a person he had underestimated in a specific way and was now updating his understanding of. The law will take time, he said. You said so yourself. I did, she said. And I have time. I'm not going anywhere. She held his gaze. Are you? Gideon stepped between them, not blocking Eleanor, but repositioning himself in a way that changed the conversation. He was looking at Ashcroft with the flat, stripped attention he had turned on the miner who laughed, and the quality of it, the complete absence of performance in it, was the most threatening thing in the room, which was a room that had recently contained significant physical threat. Get your men, Gideon said. Get off my mountain. Ashcroft looked at him for a moment. He looked at the room. He made, Eleanor thought, the first completely honest calculation she had seen him make, running the numbers as they actually stood rather than as he wanted them to stand. He picked up his hat from the floor, where it had ended up in the general disruption, and he put it on, and he walked to the door, and he stopped with his hand on the frame. You think the papers protect you, he said. He wasn't looking at either of them specifically. He was addressing the room, the situation, the outcome he had not wanted. I think the papers complicate you, Eleanor said, which is what they were designed to do. He walked out. His men collected themselves slowly and with some difficulty and followed him. The man Eleanor had hit with the skillet was assisted to his horse by 2 of the others, and she watched this from the doorway with the skillet still in her hand, and she waited until all 5 horses had started back down the mountain road before she let herself lean against the doorframe. Gideon came to stand beside her. His cheek was bleeding steadily, and he was going to look considerably worse by morning, but he was standing straight and his breathing had almost returned to normal. They stood in the doorway and listened to the horses go. You hit Cord Denton with a cast-iron skillet, Gideon said. Is that his name? He works for Ashcroft full-time, has for 3 years. Will he be all right? She asked. She had not hit him to kill him. She had hit him to stop him from doing something to Gideon, and the distinction mattered to her even now. "He'll have a headache," Gideon said, "for several days." "Good." She lowered the skillet. "Then he'll have time to reconsider his employment situation." Gideon made a sound that was, she recognized after a moment, a laugh. Short and unpracticed, like something he had not used in a while. She looked at him sideways, and he was looking out at the empty road, and his face had done that thing again, the almost shift at the corner of his mouth. "You're not what I expected," he said, "and I spent 3 years writing letters about you. You expected someone who would stand in a corner when threatened." "I expected someone capable," he said. "I didn't expect—" He stopped. He was looking at the blood on his hand from his cheek, like he'd just noticed it. "The skillet," he said. "The skillet was available," she said. "Availability is half of any good decision." She went inside and found the cloth she used for kitchen work and wet it, and came back to the doorway, and she cleaned the cut on his face with the practical attention she applied to things that needed doing. He let her do it without protest, which she suspected cost him something, and she was careful about the pressure because it was deep enough to require care, and she was not going to be rough just because she could be. "He's not done," Gideon said while she worked. "I know. The papers slow him. They don't stop him." "I know that too." She folded the cloth to a clean edge and pressed it to the worst of the cut. "He'll go back to the legal route now because the physical route failed today, and he's not reckless. He's calculated. He'll file a counterclaim against the transfer. He'll try to argue that the transfer was made under duress or that it's fraudulent. Can he make that stick? Not easily. But he'll try, and it'll take time, and time costs money." She finished with the cloth and stepped back. "We need to get you to town. This needs proper attention." "I'm fine." "You have a cut on your face that may need stitching, and I'm not qualified to do that," she said. "We're going to town." He looked at her. She looked at him. The familiar architecture of this particular dynamic. "Margaret Sue's husband was a field surgeon," she said. She mentioned it. He blinked. "How do you know that?" "I asked her about herself," Eleanor said. "People know things when you ask them about themselves." She turned and went inside to get her coat. "Come on." She had her coat on and the document case under her arm before he had fully processed the sequence of events, and she came back to the doorway and found him still standing where she had left him, looking at the road where Ashcroft's horses had gone. "Gideon," she said. He turned. "He'll come back with lawyers and paperwork, and he'll be harder to hit with a skillet," she said. "But the mountain is documented, and the title is filed, and we have witnesses. And in the long run, documentation beats intimidation if you're willing to spend the time." She met his eyes. "Are you willing?" He looked at her for a moment with the stillness that was not stillness. "I've been willing since 1876, he said. "Good." She stepped off the porch. "Then let's go get your face looked at and figure out what comes next." The wagon rolled back down the mountain toward Black Ridge, and the late morning sun was sharp and cold against the peaks. And Eleanor sat beside Gideon with the document case in her lap, and she thought about everything Ashcroft had built, and everything Gideon had built, and what it had cost both of them, and what it was going to cost before it was finished. She thought about the letters on the shelf above the fireplace, and the 9 years that stood behind them. She was not finished being angry about what had been done to her. The factory floor and the raised rent and the 2 years of arithmetic that had not been arithmetic. She was not done with that, and she was honest with herself about it. There was still a reckoning she needed, somewhere interior, with the version of her life that had been manufactured and the version that had been real. But that was its own work, and she would do it the way she did other work, steadily, without drama, in the time she had. For now the wagon was moving and the mountain was behind them, and ahead the town was waking into its noisy, functional morning, and beside her a man with a cut on his face was driving in silence in the particular way he drove, which matched her pace and did not require performance. She adjusted her grip on the document case and looked at the road ahead. Margaret Sue's hands were steady, in the way of someone who had done difficult things with them before and had made peace with the requirement. She put 4 stitches in Gideon's cheek in the back room of the laundry, by the light of 2 oil lamps, while Eleanor sat on a crate near the door and held the lamp that gave the best angle and did not look away. Gideon did not make a sound during the stitching. He gripped the edge of the work table, and he breathed in the controlled, deliberate way of a man managing pain through will rather than distance, and Margaret worked with the small, precise movements of someone who understood that speed and accuracy were the same thing in this context. When she finished, she tied off the last stitch and stood back and looked at her work the way a person looks at something they have done correctly, but not enjoyed. "It'll scar," she said. "It's not his first," Eleanor said. Margaret looked at her. "No," she agreed. "I wouldn't think so." Gideon touched the stitching carefully with 2 fingers, and then stopped touching it. He looked at Eleanor across the room. "Ashcroft's men were still at the saloon when we came through," he said. "The 2 from before." "I saw them," Eleanor said. She had not mentioned this when they'd passed. She had filed it and continued. "He left watchers," Margaret said. She was cleaning her instruments with the unhurried attention of someone returning tools to their proper state. "That means he's not done with the direct approach yet. He's watching to see what you do next before he decides his next move." "Then we should do something visible," Eleanor said. Both of them looked at her. "Not dramatic," she said. "Just visible. If he's watching to see whether we're frightened or running, we shouldn't be either of those things. We should be going about business." She looked at Gideon. "Is there anything you normally do in town on a day like this? Regular business?" "Hartwell's," he said. "I usually settle my account at the end of each month." "End of the month is 2 days away," Eleanor said. "We settle it today." He held her gaze for a moment. "You want to walk through the main street?" "I want to walk through the main street and conduct ordinary business while 2 of Ashcroft's men watch us do it," she said. "Yes." Margaret made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was related to one. "I'll walk with you," she said. "I need to pick up a bolt of linen from Hartwell anyway." She set down her instruments and untied her work apron. 3 people conducting ordinary business are more visible than 2. They walked through the main street of Black Ridge in the late morning light, Eleanor and Gideon and Margaret Sue. And Eleanor did not look at the 2 men on the saloon steps, but she was aware of them the entire time, the way you are aware of a sound that stops. She walked at her own pace, the one she had come to, not hurried and not performing unhurriedness. And she looked at the storefronts and the street and the mountains above the town, and she let herself be seen. At Hartwell's general store, Gideon settled his account, and Eleanor introduced herself to Hartwell directly, shook his hand and told him her name and thanked him for the extended credit on the previous month's provisions, which she had seen recorded in the household ledger and understood as a small act of loyalty to a man who operated on the margin of town goodwill. Hartwell was a tall, narrow man who appeared permanently skeptical, as though the frontier had given him evidence that optimism was a resource to be rationed. He shook her hand and looked at her with the assessing directness of someone making a judgment he knew he might need to rely on later. "You're the one who filed the papers," he said. Not a question. "Word travels fast," Eleanor said. "It's a small town," he said, "and Wills has a mouth on him." He looked at her hand, not her face, her hand, and she understood after a moment that he was registering the calluses. Factory work left specific marks. "You need anything," he said, "you let me know." It was not an elaborate offer, but it was not nothing, and Eleanor understood the difference. They walked back through the main street with the linen Margaret had purchased, and they passed the saloon steps again, and one of the 2 watchers, the younger one, said something to the other in a low voice as they went by, but neither of them moved and neither of them said anything to the 3 of them directly. Small. But it was information, men who had received orders to watch and not to act yet. The ride back up the mountain that afternoon was quiet in the familiar way of their rides, and Eleanor sat with the document case and let her mind work through what she knew and what she needed, running her calculations the way the machines at the factory ran, steadily, without pause, converting input to output through reliable mechanics. She knew Ashcroft's legal counterclaim would come. Her lawyer in Helena, she was already thinking of him as hers, which was a shift, had estimated the timeline at 3 to 4 weeks for the filing and then a formal hearing date, which would be months further out. The claim would contest the transfer on grounds of documentation irregularity or undue influence, because those were the 2 levers available to him, and he would use both. She needed to prepare her responses to both. She also knew something that Ashcroft did not know she knew, and she had been holding it carefully since Margaret had mentioned it on her first visit to the laundry. Pritchard was scared, not bought, and a man who was scared could be scared in more than one direction. "Tell me what you know about Pritchard's past transaction," she said to Gideon as the wagon climbed. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "How much do you know?" that there's something there. I don't have specifics. He adjusted the reins. In 1877, before he was land agent, Pritchard bought and resold a claim on the Northern Fork. The claim had a dispute attached to it, a prior filing from a man named Colbert who had abandoned the site. Pritchard bought it knowing the dispute existed, got the site cleared in the land office, and sold it to an Eastern investor for 4 times what he paid. The Colbert issue was never properly resolved, just buried. Who has access to that record? The Helena Land Office, in theory. In theory, because Pritchard has access to those files now. Yes. She sat with this. It's not buried if someone knows to look for it, she said. And an Eastern investor who bought a property with an unresolved prior claim might be very interested to know that the resolution was procedural rather than substantive. Gideon looked at her. You want to go around Pritchard? I want to give Pritchard a reason to decide that Ashcroft is the more dangerous problem, she said. Right now, Ashcroft has leverage over him. If someone else has leverage too, not threatening him, just making clear that the Colbert matter is visible, then his calculation changes. That's a fine line, Gideon said. I know it is. She was not comfortable with it, and she was not pretending to be. But we're not threatening him. We're informing him that his situation is more complicated than he's currently accounting for. The distinction was real. She held to it. I'll write the letter, she said. You review it. If you think it crosses a line, we don't send it. He was quiet for the rest of the climb, and she let him be quiet. And when they reached the cabin, he helped her down from the wagon, and they stood in the yard in the afternoon cold, and he said, Write the letter, I'll read it. She wrote it that evening at the table while Gideon tended the fire. She wrote it and crossed it out and wrote it again, because the line was real, and she was not interested in crossing it. And the third version was the version that stayed on the right side. Factual, not threatening, laying out what was knowable about the Colbert matter from public records without specifying how she knew it was knowable, and noting that her attorney in Helena was in the process of reviewing the full title history of the Wolf claim, including all adjacent transactions. She read it aloud to Gideon when she finished. He listened with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the fire. It's clean, he said when she finished. Send it. She sent it the next morning with the same writer who had gone to Helena, with instructions to deliver it directly to Pritchard's office and to note the time of delivery. Then they waited. There was work during the waiting. There was always work during the waiting, which was the practical mercy of physical life on a mountain in April, because the cabin and the land and the animals did not pause for human crises. Eleanor cleaned and organized and cooked and learned the trapline routes by walking them with Gideon on the days when the weather permitted. She learned that he had been running the lines alone for 6 years, and that the system was efficient but required 2 people to maintain properly, and she fell into the second-person role without announcement or discussion, because it was what was needed, and she was here. She also learned things about him that the letters had not contained, because letters, even honest ones, were the writer's curated version of themselves, and the person was always more complicated than the curation. He was stubborn in specific ways. He had a system for everything, and he did not enjoy deviating from the system, even when the deviation was clearly an improvement, and Eleanor had to choose her battles about which systems to improve and which to leave alone, because winning every argument was not actually winning. He was a light sleeper, lighter than her, which she would not have predicted, and she heard him sometimes in the early hours moving through the cabin, checking the door, checking the window, doing the circuits of a man who had spent 6 years as his own only security. He was kind to animals in a way that was not performed, which she had always thought was a better index of character than many more visible qualities. The horse that pulled the wagon had a name, Fletcher, and Gideon spoke to him in the same flat, straightforward way he spoke to everyone, and Fletcher had the relaxed, well-cared-for bearing of an animal that had never had reason to be surprised by the person handling him. On the 5th day after they sent the letter to Pritchard, a response came. Not from Pritchard directly. From Ashcroft's lawyer in Helena, a formal letter addressed to Gideon, notifying him of a counterclaim filed with the Territorial Land Office contesting the transfer of the Wolf claim on the grounds of procedural irregularity. The letter was precisely what she had predicted, timed almost exactly to the day she had estimated. She read it twice and handed it to Gideon and said, "Send this to our lawyer today. He needs to file the response within 10 days. Our lawyer. Gideon noticed the word. She noticed him notice it. It's your claim, she said. It's in my name. We share a lawyer. Yes, he said. He was looking at the letter. She watched his face. What is it? He set the letter down on the table. He looked at it for a moment longer. Then he looked at her, and it was one of those moments where whatever was usually controlled in him was not entirely controlled, and she could see the edge of something that was not the flat, practical man he presented to the world. 7 years, he said. I've been sitting on this mountain for 7 years waiting for him to find the angle that would work. And every year I told myself I had it managed. He stopped. I didn't have it managed. I had it stalled. You had it protected, she said. That's different from managed, but it's not nothing. I should have gone to Helena years ago, filed more aggressively, found Pritchard's history earlier. You didn't know about the Colbert matter earlier, she said. I should have looked harder. She sat down across from him. Yes, she said, because it was true and she was not going to soften it. Probably. But you were one person running a claim and a trapline and managing a legal dispute with a man who has a great deal more resources than you, and you kept it standing for 7 years, which is not nothing. She paused. You also spent a considerable portion of those 7 years writing letters and tracking a woman in Cleveland when you could have been building a legal strategy. So there's that. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Yes, he said. There's that. The point is we have it now, she said. Whatever we should have done before, we have the filing, we have the witnesses, we have the lawyer, and we have Pritchard looking at a piece of correspondence that told him his position is visible. She put her hand flat on the letter. This counterclaim is what a man does when his main options have been cut off. This is the expensive, slow option. He's filing this because the quick option didn't work. He's not finished, Gideon said. I know he's not finished. She stood up. That's why we send the letter to Helena today. He sent it. On the 8th day after the counterclaim arrived, a second letter came from Helena. This one was from their lawyer, and it said that Agent Pritchard had contacted the lawyer's office directly without going through Ashcroft or Ashcroft's attorney to inquire about the timeline of the Wolf Claim Title History Review. Eleanor read this standing at the door where the writer had handed it to her, still in her morning coat, and she read it twice to make sure she was reading it correctly, and then she went inside and handed it to Gideon without saying anything. He read it. He looked up. He went around Ashcroft, Gideon said. He went around Ashcroft, Eleanor confirmed. The shift was small, but it was real. Pritchard contacting the lawyer directly meant he was looking for a way to understand his own exposure independently of Ashcroft's version of events. It meant he was running his own calculation, and his own calculation was producing different numbers than Ashcroft wanted it to produce. Write back to our lawyer, Eleanor said. Tell him to give Pritchard the full timeline, everything. The original filing date, the adjacent claim purchases by Ashcroft's men, the dates, the transfer documents, all of it. She looked at the letter. And tell him to be courteous. Pritchard is not our enemy. He's a scared man who made a bad decision and has been living in the shadow of it. We don't need to make it worse for him than it already is. We need him to do something, Gideon said. Courtesy doesn't necessarily produce action. Courtesy combined with clarity of consequence produces action, she said. He can see what's coming. A legal proceeding that will put his Colbert matter under scrutiny whether or not he's Ashcroft's man. He's better off on the right side of it. She set the letter on the shelf with the other papers, the growing archive of this situation. He's smart enough to see that. She did not know for certain that Pritchard was smart enough, but she was willing to act as though he was, because the alternative was assuming he was not, and that assumption only led to more aggressive action, and she was not ready for more aggressive action. Not yet. That night, after supper, Gideon sat at the table and did not pick up anything to do with his hands, which was unusual. He was a person who occupied idle time with work, and she had noticed that he did not know what to do with an evening that didn't have a task attached to it. He sat with his coffee, and he looked at the fire, and Eleanor sat across from him and hemmed a shirt she had been meaning to get to, and they existed in the same space in the particular silence they had built over the weeks of this, a silence that was not empty, but not required to be filled. I want to tell you something, he said. She kept her eyes on the hemming. All right. About why I didn't tell you everything at the start. You told me you were afraid I'd make a different choice. That's part of it. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. The other part, he stopped. In the familiar way of a man locating something he doesn't often have to locate. I'd been alone for a long time, and I I had this version of you in my head from the letters, from knowing about you. And I was afraid that the real version wouldn't match the one I'd built. He said it the way he said things that cost something, flat, direct, not performing the cost, which is not fair to you. I know that. I had built a person in my head and I was afraid you would be different. Eleanor stitched 2 more inches in silence. Was I different? She said. Yes. A pause. More difficult. More difficult than your version of me. Your version was, he almost smiled, quieter. She looked up at him. I was looking at the fire with the almost shift at the corner of his mouth that she had learned to read as the closest he got to amusement. I'm sorry to disappoint you, she said. You didn't disappoint me. The almost shift settled into something more considered. You were better. The difficult version is better. He said it matter-of-factly, the way he stated other things that were true. I just wasn't prepared for it. She returned to the hemming. She stitched another inch. She was aware of a pressure behind her sternum that was not comfortable and not unpleasant, and that she did not have a precise word for. The letters, she said. The ones under the floor. You wrote that you'd been trying to get to something, since the afternoon in the rain. She didn't look up. What were you trying to get to? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. The ability to be in the same room with someone without feeling like I was taking up space I hadn't earned, he said. She stitched another inch. The fire settled in the grate. You earned space by being in it, she said. There's no prior qualification. I know that now, he said. It took me a while. How long? He looked at her across the table, and the firelight did what firelight does to faces, and she looked back at him over the hemming with the steadiness she had built her entire life out of whatever was available, and she did not look away. Approximately 3 weeks, he said. She went back to the hemming, but something in her chest had shifted, and she knew it, and she filed it in the category of things to return to when she had more data, and she kept stitching. The response from their lawyer came 11 days later, and it was not alone. It was accompanied by a formal notice from the Territorial Land Office, signed by Agent Pritchard, acknowledging receipt of the Wolf claim title documentation and suspending the Ashcroft counterclaim pending procedural review. Suspension was not resolution. Suspension was a pause, a breath in the legal machinery, a land agent deciding to look at the facts before he committed to a direction. But a pause was not nothing. A pause was the thing they had been working toward. Eleanor read the notice 3 times, standing at the table, and then she set it down and she said nothing, because she did not have the right words yet for what she was feeling, which was something complicated about years of arithmetic and the factory floor and the boarding house room and the sewing kit her mother had left her, and how all of it had led to a table in a mountain cabin in Montana with a land agent suspension notice under her hands. Gideon read it and set it down and said, "He suspended it. He did. Ashcroft will know within days. Yes, he'll be angry. He will." She folded her hands on top of the notice. And when he's angry, he makes decisions from the anger, and decisions from anger are not his best ones. She looked up. We need to be ready for that. Ready looked like several things over the next 10 days. It looked like Gideon reinforcing the cabin door with additional hardware from the storage room. It looked like Eleanor writing to their lawyer with a request to prepare a formal complaint to the Territorial Governor's Office, documenting the full history of Ashcroft's land acquisition methods, complete with dates and names and all adjacent claim purchases. Not filed yet, prepared. Ready to file if needed. It looked like a conversation with Margaret Sue, in which Eleanor asked her whether she still had her letter to the Territorial Governor about Tom Carey's case, the one that had gone unanswered, and Margaret said yes, she had a copy, and Eleanor said, I'd like to attach it to our complaint as supporting documentation, with your permission. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Tom Carey lost his claim, Margaret said. I know, Eleanor said, but his case is evidence of a pattern. Patterns are what make individual complaints into something a governor has to respond to. Margaret nodded once. You have my permission. Ashcroft's response came not in person but through his lawyer, in the form of a letter delivered to the cabin by an actual courier, a formal notice of intent to appeal the suspension of the counterclaim, citing specific procedural grounds, 5 pages of legal language that their lawyer translated in a follow-up letter as, he's contesting the suspension, which is his right, and it'll take another 6 weeks to process, minimum. 6 weeks. Eleanor held that in her mind and turned it over. 6 weeks in which the suspension stood. 6 weeks in which the title remained under her name. 6 weeks in which Ashcroft was paying lawyers and writers and watchers and getting nothing for it but time passing. "He's spending money," she said to Gideon that evening. "Significant money. Lawyers, the courier, his men in town." She set the lawyer's letter on the pile that had grown on the shelf. "How long can he sustain this before the Eastern investors start asking questions?" Gideon considered. "He's been spending for years on this," he said. "The adjacent claim purchases alone, which means the investors are already impatient," she said, "which means he's under pressure from 2 directions now, us and them." She looked at the pile of letters and notices and filings and counterfilings that had accumulated over the weeks. What do the investors know about the legal situation? Probably what he's told them, which is probably not what's actually happening. She turned to him. "Who are they?" "The investors." He frowned. "There are 3 main ones. Hargrove Banking out of New York, a land development firm called Western Territories Consolidated, and a private investor named Cross, Philadelphia." She felt the name land before she fully registered why. "Hargrove," she said. "Hargrove Banking, yes. The same family as Hargrove's stable. In Cleveland." Gideon stared at her. The color of his face changed slightly. "The stable where you worked," she said. Her voice was very even. "The stable where I walked through the yard. The Hargrove who accused you of stealing grain." "They're common names," Gideon said, but even as he said it, she could see him running the thread back, pulling it, following it to where it led. "Are they?" she said. He stood up and went to the storage room and came back with a locked document box she had not seen before. And he unlocked it and went through the papers inside with focused hands, and he found a document and spread it on the table. It was a record of Ashcroft's investors from a filing his lawyer had obtained during the original boundary dispute proceedings in 1879. Eleanor looked at the names listed under financial interest, and she found Hargrove. Not the stable, not the Cleveland business, but Hargrove Capital Holdings, New York, which was the parent organization of a family whose money had started with a stable and grown into something larger and considerably less visible. "He was always connected to Hargrove," Gideon said. His voice was very quiet. "I found this in 79, and I thought it was coincidence. That Hargrove was a common enough name in Eastern banking." "It's not coincidence," Eleanor said. He looked at the document. He looked at her. "It goes back further than I knew," he said. "Yes." She sat down. "The stable. Hargrove's money in Ashcroft's operation. The accusations against you in Cleveland, which you said Hargrove himself made, that were designed to drive you out before you could establish yourself." She traced the sequence with her eyes, not with her finger, because she did not want to touch the document yet. "And then 9 years later, the same money funds the man trying to take what you built." "I was nobody in Cleveland," Gideon said. "Why would Hargrove care about a stable hand?" "You weren't nobody," Eleanor said. "You were a man who was going to file a mining claim in Montana. Did anyone know that? Before you left?" He was very still. "I talked to a man at the land office in Cleveland," he said slowly, "before I went west, getting information about the process." He stopped. "The man he knew Hargrove. I remember thinking it was a small world." "Not a small world," Eleanor said. "A connected one." He sat down. He looked at the document on the table, and he looked at nothing, the way a person looks at nothing when they are looking at something inside. "They've been trying to stop me since before I had anything worth stopping," he said. "They tried to stop you in Cleveland, and it didn't work because of one afternoon in November rain," Eleanor said. "And you came west and built something worth taking, and then they came after the thing worth taking." She looked at him steadily. "And now we have the connection on paper. Hargrove Capital Holdings and Ashcroft's investor filing from 1879, and Hargrove's history with you in Cleveland, and the timeline." She tapped the document. "This is not just a boundary dispute anymore. This is a documented pattern of interference stretching 9 years. It's still a long way from proof of conspiracy," he said. "It's evidence," she said. "It's enough evidence to make a governor read a complaint rather than ignore it, especially combined with Margaret's letter about Tom Carey." She pulled the document toward her. "I need to write to our lawyer tonight." "Eleanor." She looked up. He was looking at her with the expression she had begun to understand, the stripped-down one, the one under the flatness, the one that cost him something to let her see. 9 years ago, he said, you walked through a yard in the rain and said something true because it was the right thing to do, and you didn't think about it again. I didn't remember it, she said honestly. I know. He held her gaze. I'm saying that afternoon changed everything, not just for me. The whole sequence of it. He stopped. Started again. If you hadn't stopped, I would have been arrested. I wouldn't have gone west. There would be no claim, no mountain, no... He made a small gesture that indicated the cabin, the document, the whole complicated architecture of what they were sitting inside. She understood what he was saying. She sat with it for a moment. I didn't do it for any of that, she said. I did it because someone was being treated badly in front of me, and I had the capacity to say something. I know, he said. That's what I mean. She looked at him across the table with the fire between them and the accumulated papers of 7 years of his fight and 3 weeks of their shared one spread between them, and she thought about capacity. The specific kind that wasn't talent or intelligence or beauty or any of the graded qualities the world assigned value to, just the ordinary human capacity to stop when stopping was needed and do the available thing. She had been told, in many ways and by many people, that she was insufficient. Too much in body, too little in other ways, not what was wanted, not what was required, not the shape that fit the expectation. She had never stopped believing she had capacity. That had been the one thing that held. We should write that letter, she said. Yes, he said. He did not move immediately. Gideon? Yes? After we write the letter, she said carefully, I'd like to sit by the fire for a while, without doing anything. She looked at the papers. We've been doing things constantly since I got here. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know how to do that, he said. Just sit. I know, she said. I'll show you. He looked at her and the corner of his mouth moved, and this time she let herself see it fully, and she did not file it away for later examination. They wrote the letter first, a thorough one, laying out the Hargrove connection and the 9-year timeline, and requesting that their lawyer prepare a formal submission to the governor's office, combining their documentation with Margaret's prior complaint. It took an hour and 3 drafts and 2 disagreements about wording, and the final version was better for the disagreements. Then Eleanor put 2 logs on the fire and moved her chair closer to it and sat down. And after a moment Gideon moved his stool to the same angle, and they sat in the warmth of the fire, while outside the mountain went through its nightly business of wind and cold and the sounds of things moving in the dark, and neither of them spoke for a long time. It was not comfortable exactly, the sitting. He was right that he didn't know how to do it, and she could feel the effort it took him not to stand up and find something to do with his hands. But he stayed, and the effort became gradually less visible, and the fire worked its way through the 2 logs she had put on, and the sound of the mountain outside was very large and very old and not interested in any of their complications. The letter will take 4 days to reach Helena, he said eventually. Yes, she said, and then another week before the lawyer responds. Approximately. So we wait, he said. We wait, she agreed, but we've done the work. The waiting is just time passing now. He was quiet for another moment. I'm not good at that either, he said. Time passing. You built a cabin, she said, on a mountain, alone, for 6 years. That was time-filling, he said, not time passing. She considered the distinction. It was real, and she had not thought of it that way, and she noted it and filed it in the category of things he understood about himself that she had not yet understood about him. All right, she said, then we fill it. With what? She looked at the fire. Tell me something about the mountain, she said. Something you know that no one else does. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might deflect, which was also his right. Then he started talking, and the fire burned down slowly, and she listened. The governor's response came on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after their lawyer filed the formal complaint. Eleanor was on this trapline when Gideon found her with the letter, riding Fletcher up the eastern ridge with his coat open despite the cold, which told her something had happened before he said a word. She was standing at the second marker resetting a sprung trap with the specific patience that trap setting required, and she looked up at the sound of hooves, and she read his face before she read the letter. Read it, he said, and handed it down. She read it standing in the snow with her work gloves still on, and the letter from the office of the territorial governor of Montana informed them that an inquiry had been opened into the land acquisition practices of Victor Ashcroft and associated entities, that the Wolf claim suspension appeal had been denied pending the outcome of that inquiry, and that Agent Pritchard had been placed on administrative leave while the inquiry reviewed the conduct of the Territorial Land Office in connection with the Ashcroft boundary complaints. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it inside her coat next to her chest, the way she had carried the documents on the night they rode to town in the dark, and she finished resetting the trap with steady hands. "Eleanor," Gideon said. "I heard it," she said. She pressed the mechanism down and checked it and stood up. "Pritchard went to the governor's office himself," she said. "That's why the response came this fast. He didn't wait for the complaint to work its way through normal channels. He walked in and told them what he knew." "That's what the lawyer thinks too," Gideon said. "He sent a separate note." She walked back to where Fletcher stood, and she looked up at Gideon on the horse, and the mountain was very quiet around them, the way mountains go quiet after a snowfall, every sound absorbed and accounted for. "It's not finished," she said. "No," he agreed. "The inquiry takes time. Ashcroft will contest it. He has lawyers and money, and he will use both." She looked at the tree line above them. "But the ground has shifted." "Yes," Gideon said. "It has." She put her hand on Fletcher's neck briefly, not petting him, just contact, and then she walked back down the ridge toward the cabin, and Gideon rode beside her at walking pace, and neither of them said anything more for a while because there was a kind of silence that was appropriate to a moment like this, and they had both gotten better at recognizing it. The inquiry unfolded over the following 3 months, in the way that official proceedings unfold. Slowly, with paperwork, with delays that were not always explicable, with small developments that required responses and responses that generated counter-responses. Their lawyer in Helena became a regular correspondent, his letters arriving with the consistency of something structural, and Eleanor organized them chronologically in the document case and maintained a running summary of where each thread stood, because she had learned that the person who understood the full picture most clearly was the person best positioned to act when action was needed. Ashcroft did contest it. He filed objections through 2 different lawyers, and he wrote to Eastern newspapers with a version of events that made him the aggrieved party. And for a period of about 3 weeks in June, there were articles in the Eastern press about frontier land disputes and the arbitrary power of territorial governors. And Eleanor read all of them that their lawyer sent copies of, and she noted what was accurate and what was manufactured. And she wrote careful, factual letters in response to the ones that named the Wolf claim specifically, citing document numbers and filing dates, and the testimony of named witnesses. She was not a writer by training, but she had spent 31 years communicating with people who had power over her livelihood, and she had learned in that time that the most effective communication was specific, concrete, and free of emotion that the reader could dismiss. She wrote the way she hemmed, steadily, without drama, each stitch placed where it was needed. Margaret Sue's name appeared in 2 of the newspaper responses as a witness to the original transfer filing, and Margaret received a letter from one of Ashcroft's lawyers demanding she clarify her involvement. She brought the letter to Eleanor on a Thursday morning and set it on the table without a word. Eleanor read it. "He's trying to see if the witnesses will recant," she said, under pressure. "I'm not recanting anything," Margaret said. "I know you're not," Eleanor said. "Write back and say that your signature stands and that you're available to testify under oath to its circumstances, and give the lawyer our attorney's name as the point of contact for any further inquiries." Margaret wrote it that afternoon in Eleanor's kitchen, at the table, while Eleanor made coffee, and the 2 of them read the draft together, and Margaret sent it unchanged, and that was the end of that particular pressure. Hartwell signed a supporting affidavit about the timeline of Gideon's account with his store, establishing continuous occupation and legitimate business activity on the claim for 6 years. He did it without being asked twice, and he did not charge for the notarization, which he did himself because he had the authority and the inclination. The man whose claim on the South Fork had been taken, Tom Carey, was located by their lawyer in a town in Wyoming where he had gone after losing the claim, and he sent a written statement about what had happened to him that added 3 specific dates and 2 named witnesses to the pattern of conduct that the governor's inquiry was examining. Eleanor read his statement when the lawyer forwarded it, and she thought about what she had said to Margaret in the laundry, that Tom Carey had probably stopped when the governor didn't respond. And she was glad she had been wrong, or at least imprecise, because Tom Carey had not stopped so much as he had been stopped, by exhaustion and resources and isolation, and those were different things from stopping. She thought about that distinction often in the months that followed. The difference between stopping and being stopped. She had come close to the second kind in Cleveland, in the last year before she left. The arithmetic getting tighter, the options narrowing, the sense of walls coming in that was not paranoia but accurate accounting. She had not been stopped entirely, but she had been close enough to understand the shape of it. The difference, she had come to think, was not strength or courage in any dramatic sense. It was just the refusal to accept the story being written for you as the only possible story. She had sold her mother's sewing kit and bought a train ticket not because she was brave, but because the alternative was letting someone else's arithmetic be the final word on her life, and she was not willing to do that. She did not think she was special for this. She thought most people had more capacity than the world allowed them to use, and that the primary function of systems like Ashcroft's, the quiet compressions, the raised rents and reduced wages and procedural barriers, was not to take things from people but to convince people they had never had anything worth taking. She thought about this and she did not say it aloud because she was not a person who delivered observations in the manner of conclusions, but she held it as something true that the months on the mountain had made clearer than it had been before. In August, 4 months after the inquiry opened, Victor Ashcroft settled. The settlement came through lawyers, and it was not announced in any newspaper, and it did not contain an admission of wrongdoing, because settlements never contained admissions of wrongdoing when the wrongdoer had enough lawyers. What it contained was a withdrawal of all boundary complaints against the Wolf claim, a financial settlement to Tom Carey that their lawyer described as adequate without using the word sufficient, and Ashcroft's agreement to divest his interest in the 2 adjacent claims he had acquired through methods the inquiry had found irregular. He did not come to the mountain to deliver this news himself. He sent a lawyer with a document, and the document was witnessed and signed, and that was the end of Victor Ashcroft's involvement in their lives. Eleanor sat at the table with the signed settlement in front of her, and she felt less than she had expected to feel. Not disappointment. The outcome was what they had worked for. But the resolution of a long thing always carried less weight in the moment than the working toward it. The working had occupied her for months, had shaped every morning and most evenings, had been the organizing structure around which everything else arranged itself. The settlement was the final sentence of a story she had been writing for a long time, and final sentences, when you reached them, were quieter than the paragraphs before. Gideon came in from outside and looked at the document on the table and then looked at her. "It's done," she said. He sat down. He picked up the document and read it and set it down, and he looked at it the way he looked at the mountains sometimes, with the attention of someone who has been managing a thing for so long that managing it has become more familiar than not managing it. "He got away clean," he said. "He got away," she said. "Not clean." She looked at the settlement. "The inquiry findings are public record. Anyone doing business with him going forward will have access to them." She folded her hands. His Eastern investors saw those findings. Hargrove Capital Holdings withdrew from his operation in June. That's why he settled. He ran out of money to keep fighting. "That's not justice," Gideon said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." She looked at him directly. "It's what was available. What was available was enough to stop him. Justice is a different project." He held her gaze. He did not look satisfied, and she did not try to make him look satisfied because he was right that it wasn't justice, and pretending otherwise would have been a lie between them, and they had committed early and without discussion to not lying to each other, which was one of the things she had come to rely on. "Tom Carey got something," she said. "Margaret's complaint is part of the public record now. Pritchard resigned, quietly, but he resigned, and the new land agent in Helena knows that the previous one's conduct is part of an inquiry file." She picked up the settlement and straightened its edges. "It's not nothing." "No," he said. "It's not nothing." They were quiet for a moment. The cabin was warm, genuinely warm, the warmth of a space that had been properly tended through a summer, and outside the August light was coming through the window at the angle it had at this time of day, which she had learned over the months as specifically as she had learned everything else about this place. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at him. It was the question she had not been asked, in one form or another, for most of her life. Not by employers or landlords or the world that graded bodies and found hers wanting. Not even, in the early weeks, by him. With what? She said. With this. He made the gesture again, the small one that indicated the cabin and the mountain and everything contained in the word this. Now that it's not under threat. She thought about it honestly, because he had asked honestly, and that was what the question deserved. I want to fix the window in the storage room properly, she said. The wedge has been a temporary solution for 6 months. His mouth moved. That's not what I meant. I know, she said, but it's the first thing. She set the settlement on the shelf with the other papers. The letters, the documents, the whole archive of this. I want to extend the garden plot before the season's over. The soil on the south side is better than we've been using. She looked at her hands on the table. And I want to write to Tom Carey, not through the lawyer, just directly, to say that his statement mattered. All right, Gideon said. And I want to stay, she said. If that's still... She stopped, looked at him. I came here without a real choice, at the start. You made a decision, and I went along with it because the alternative was worse, and that was honest, but it wasn't exactly chosen. She held his gaze. I'm choosing it now, staying. This place, this work, this... She made the same small gesture he made. I want that to be clear. He was very still. It's clear, he said. Good, she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, which was not something he had done before. He was not a person who touched easily, and she had not asked him to be. And she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for a moment with the afternoon light coming through the window and the settlement on the shelf and the mountain outside going about its enormous ancient business. It was not a perfect moment. Her back ached from the trapline, and she had a blister on her right palm from the fence repair she'd been doing in the north yard, and the cabin still needed the window fixed and the garden extended and about 40 other things she had on her list. His stitches had healed into a scar that ran from his cheekbone to his jaw that would be there for the rest of his life. They were two people who had come to each other through 9 years of indirection and 3 months of legal combat and the specific complicated territory of learning to trust someone who had kept things from you for reasons you understood but hadn't finished processing. None of that was gone. The blister and the scar and the not quite finished processing, all of it was still present and accounted for. She had stopped expecting perfect moments sometime in her 20s, and she did not miss them. What she had found more valuable and more durable was moments that were real. Moments where what was present was actually present and not performing the idea of itself. This was one of those. She let go of his hand after a moment and stood up and went to get the letter paper because she wanted to write to Tom Carey while the settlement was fresh and the words were available. The letter she wrote to Tom Carey was not long. She told him that his statement had been part of what turned the inquiry from a possibility into a proceeding, and that the settlement required Ashcroft to return one of the adjacent claims that had been acquired irregularly, and that the claim in question was not his original South Fork claim, but that the principle had been established in a record that would not be easily buried. She told him she was sorry it had taken this long, and that she was sorry the resolution was imperfect. She did not offer consolation that she didn't mean, and she did not tell him things would be different going forward in any way that she couldn't verify. She read it back to herself and she thought it was honest, which was the most she could do for a man she had never met who had lost something real. She sent it. The window in the storage room got a proper frame repair in September, when Gideon had time and the weather allowed for outdoor work on the wall. Eleanor held the boards while he fitted them and passed tools when he needed them, and they argued about the best way to seat the frame for about 20 minutes before arriving at a solution that was better than either of their original approaches, which was, she had come to understand, the typical outcome of their arguments. The garden plot extension happened in the same month, and she was right about the south side soil. It was better, more sheltered, and when she put in a late planting of root vegetables on the extended plot, they came up stronger than anything she had grown on the original patch. She wrote to her lawyer in Helena thanking him for his work and settling the final account, which took most of what she had saved from the manufacturing work in Cleveland, and she did not regret it. She wrote to Clara, the red-haired woman from the train, who had settled in Black Ridge with a man named Foster, and who had sent Eleanor a note in May asking if things were all right. She told Clara that things were all right, more specifically and more honestly than that phrase usually deserved. And Clara wrote back with the warmth of a woman who was paying attention. And that was the beginning of something that functioned like friendship, built on the currency of actual information rather than performed connection. In October, Margaret Sue invited them to dinner at her establishment. Not the laundry, her living quarters above it. A small, comfortable space that smelled like clean linen and the particular herbs she grew in pots on the south-facing windowsill. Hartwell came too, and a man from the Eastern Claims named Rourke, who Eleanor had not met but who Gideon had known for years. And they ate Margaret's cooking, which was excellent and unpretentious. And they talked about the winter coming and the state of the road between Black Ridge and the county seat, and whether the new land agent in Helena was going to be an improvement over Pritchard. Eleanor sat at Margaret's table and listened to these people talk about the ordinary geography of their lives here, the specific knowledge of a specific place, and the practical problems of a practical existence. And she felt herself inside it, not observing from the outside, not the woman from Cleveland who had arrived at the depot in someone else's story. Just there, present, known by her first name to people who had reason to trust her. She thought about her mother, briefly, the sewing kit, the particular value of leaving someone something small and useful rather than something grand and symbolic. Her mother had been a practical woman who had lived a life of compression and constraint and had not complained about it, which was not, Eleanor now thought, the same as accepting it. Her mother had found the room that existed within the constraint and used it fully, and the sewing kit had been a version of this, a small, precise tool handed from one pair of capable hands to another. She would have liked her mother to see this dinner. The table in the mountain outside, and the man across from her who was telling Rourke something about the North Trap Line in his flat, unembellished way. And the fact that Eleanor was here by choice now, having chosen it with full information and clear eyes. She would have liked that. She held it briefly and let it go, because it was not a thought that led anywhere useful except to grief. And grief was real, but it was not the whole of the evening. The snow came properly in November, the kind that stayed, and the cabin became the sealed, warm interior world that it became in winter. Smaller, more intentional, every action considered because the cold outside made unconsidered action expensive. Eleanor had been preparing for this for weeks, the way Gideon prepared for it, with the systematic attention of someone who understood that the margin between adequate and inadequate was thinner in winter than in any other season. She was good at winter. She had not known this about herself until Montana showed her, because Cleveland winters were a different kind of cold. The cold of a city, mediated by walls and neighbors and the residual heat of industry. Mountain winter was categorical. It did not negotiate. You were prepared or you were not, and if you were not, the mountain was not interested in your explanation. She was prepared. On an evening in late November, the first real storm of the season moving through the pass above them, and the cabin sealed against it, and the fire doing what the fire did, Gideon looked up from the harness he was mending and said, without preamble, "I want to ask you something." She looked up from the sock she was darning. "All right. The letters," he said. "You've never told me what you thought of them." She considered this. "I've had them for 8 months," she said. "I know. I've read them more than once." "I know that too." She looked at her darning and then set it down in her lap. "I thought they were honest," she said. "More honest than most things people say directly." She looked at him. "I thought you were a person who knew himself better than he knew what to do with himself." "That's accurate," he said. "I thought the letter where you crossed out the same sentence twice and wrote it a third time was the most—" She stopped. "It was the one I kept coming back to." "Which one was that?" "The fourth one, where you wrote that you didn't know what you were doing." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know what I was doing," he said. "Nobody does," she said. "But most people pretend otherwise. You just wrote it down, twice, and then a third time because crossing it out didn't resolve it." She picked up the darning again. "I respected that." The fire worked through its wood. The storm moved over the mountain and made its sounds against the roof and the walls, testing and finding them adequate. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes." "I'm glad you stopped in that yard," he said. "In the rain." She looked at him across the fire. I was looking at her with the expression that was not the public face, not the flat, careful management of what he showed the world, but the other one, the one underneath, the one that had written 20 letters and buried them under a floorboard because sending them had been too much and destroying them had been impossible. "I'm glad I stopped too," she said. Though I'll tell you honestly, I didn't think about it much at the time. I know, he said. That's the part that stays with me. He looked at the fire. You didn't do it because you were watching for a chance to do something good. You did it because it was there to do, and you were there to do it. She sat with this. She did not argue with it, because it was true, and she had stopped arguing with true things for the sake of modesty. Most good things are like that, she said. Not chosen from some great height, just available and then done. He nodded. He went back to the harness. She went back to the sock. The storm passed sometime in the night, and by morning the mountain was white and still, and the light came through the window with the particular brightness of light reflected off new snow, filling the cabin with a quality of illumination that was different from every other season, cleaner, colder, more honest in what it showed. She stood at the window in her coat and her boots, and she looked at it, and she thought about what the world looked like from the outside versus what it looked like from the inside, and how the distance between those two views was exactly the size of a life. Not the life the world saw, not the body it graded or the history it dismissed, but the interior one, the one that kept running its arithmetic and adjusting its calculations and refusing to let someone else's ledger be the final word. She had spent 31 years in that interior life. It had been lonely sometimes and insufficient, and the arithmetic had gotten very tight at points, and she had made mistakes and taken wrong turns and sold her mother's sewing kit for a ticket west without knowing what she was buying. What she had bought, it turned out, was this. The window and the snow and the man in the next room starting the fire, and the work that needed doing every day, and the people in the town below who knew her name and what she had done and trusted her for it, the letters on the shelf above the fireplace, the scar on his face that had healed into something permanent and honest. None of it was what she would have designed, given the option. She would not have designed the years in the factory, or the raised rent, or the grief of watching her options narrow. She would not have designed Ashcroft, or the legal fight, or the months of waiting on correspondence from Helena. She would not have designed any of it, but she had not been given the option of designing it. She had only been given the option of doing something with it, and she had, and it had led here, and here was enough, more than enough, more than the world had ever suggested she deserved, which was not a high bar, but she was no longer using the world's bar. She was using her own. Gideon appeared in the doorway of the back room, still pulling his suspenders up, hair unmade, his scarred face carrying the specific expression of a man not yet fully awake. "Snow," he said, looking past her to the window. "Yes," she said. "About a foot. Trap lines will need checking." "I know." He looked at her. She looked at him. The ordinary morning landscape of two people who have agreed, without ceremony, to share a life. "Coffee first," he said. "Coffee first," she agreed. She turned from the window and went to make it, and he went to build up the fire, and the cabin filled slowly with warmth and the smell of coffee and the small particular sounds of a household waking into its day, and outside the mountain held them in its enormous cold keeping and did not know or care that this was anything other than ordinary. But it was not ordinary. It was the specific and unrepeatable result of one woman stopping in a yard on a November afternoon in the rain, and a man who had carried that afternoon for 9 years, and all the complicated machinery of the years between, the choices made and not made, the things said and kept silent, the documents filed and the fights fought, and the fire tended night after night in a cold that did not negotiate. It was not a story about beauty or worth as the world measured those things. It was a story about capacity, the ordinary, undramatic, daily kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that stops in the rain when stopping is needed, and stays when staying is needed, and writes the letter and holds the lamp and swings the skillet and sits by the fire long enough to learn what sitting still costs another person. The coffee was ready. She poured 2 cups. She set one at his place at the table and took hers to the window for one more look at the snow and the mountain and the long white stillness of a winter morning that was entirely, at last, her own.